Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield are two heavyweights in the realm of RPGs, and since both are ostensibly vying to be the top dog in 2023, let's compare each of these offerings and see which stands a better chance of claiming that coveted title. Here we go. Now, I'm sure many of you will argue that these two games, while obviously in the same genre and possessing some of the same mechanics, are worlds apart and therefore not comparable. But whether you like it or not, people do evaluate games based on the overall value they will provide them with. Starfield is a game of epic space exploration with warring factions, inventory management, side quests, and avoiding the authorities. In stark contrast, Baldur's Gate 3 is a game of epic fantasy exploration, warring factions, inventory management, side quests, and avoiding the authorities. I'm oversimplifying here, of course, but there's little doubt that Starfield and Baldur's Gate 3 are probably more similar to one another than you'd initially imagine, but there's no denying there are several key differences. In Baldur's Gate 3, the player finds themselves pitted against a terrible threat known as the Absolute, a new god that threatens the stability of the Forgotten Realms and its inhabitants. In Starfield, you assume the role of the Spacefarer who comes into contact with a mysterious artifact which causes you to lose consciousness. You later end up joining an organization known as Constellation that is intent on finding and recovering various artifacts scattered across the galaxy. While the general gist behind each of these stories has been done many times before, I will say that the complexity of both narratives is suitably high. But if you know anything about Baldur's Gate 3, the number of dialogue options and cutscenes you can experience equates to something like 174 hours, or 2 million words if reports are to be believed. Assuming an average of 10 words per line, this is somewhere around 200,000 lines of dialogue, which is nuts. Amazingly, Starfield reportedly has more than 250,000 lines of dialogue according to October 2022 figures. So from a quantity perspective, it seems like Starfield manages to beat Baldur's Gate 3 by a fair margin. Of course, having more dialogue or cutscenes doesn't necessarily make a game better or worse, and there's no denying that Baldur's Gate 3 is intensely complex in terms of its plot and number of ways things can turn out. And the truth is, the dialogue choices in Starfield are... yeah, they're not even close to the quality of Baldur's Gate 3. A lot of it feels forced and awkward, and overall it messes up your immersion and investment in the game. In this department, Baldur's Gate 3 wins by a metric mile, no questions asked. Alright, so how about the gameplay? Combat in Starfield is pretty standard fare, but as an added bonus, you can shift between first and third person perspective, which is a nice touch. And while it may not be insane, the space combat is better than many fans anticipated, so good job on that front. I am fully aware that Baldur's Gate 3 uses traditional turn-based combat and is thus more strategic in nature, so I can understand that this is much harder to compare and left up to preferences. So let's take this a step further and talk about pacing. This is where things get more interesting, and it's possible to make more incisive comparisons. It's no secret that there's a lot to do in both Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield, but the gameplay loop in each differs significantly. While I won't say Baldur's Gate 3 is perfectly paced, it does well to shift between intricate dialogue with carefully considered responses and intense turn-based combat. The trouble with Starfield is that you often have to flit between different in-game menus which have annoyingly long loading times, and while combat in and of itself is pretty much fun, there are often long tracts of time between encounters. And for at least the first 10 hours or so, the pacing is really slow. I totally get that there's a lot to do and enjoy, but if it takes several hours to get going, that does tend to sully things somewhat. For this reason, it's safe to say that Baldur's Gate 3 wins on this front since the management of the player's experience is well considered and better tailored to their expectations. Let's move on to world building and interactivity. Both Baldur's Gate 3 and Starfield are massive in their scope, but Starfield really is way bigger owing to the whole more than 1,000 planets to explore thing. Again, from a sheer quantity and scale perspective, there's no denying that Starfield wins hands down. But there's a problem here. Yes, there are over 1,000 planets, but just about all of them are procedurally generated and entirely devoid of life. Part of Starfield's value is that it offers the ability to build outposts, but the question is, if there's no reason to revisit some or even most planets, why bother building an outpost? And moreover, more than a few gamers have had problems with building outposts and are really hoping that patches and future DLCs will adequately address this problem. Still, the level of graphical detail and the sheer complexity of certain worlds in Starfield is really something to marvel at, but it just doesn't feel like enough to compensate for all the literally empty space there is out there. Compared with the world of Baldur's Gate 3, it feels much richer and more immersive, and every character you meet has their own history, personality, and worldview. There are multiple ways to deal with situations, no two quests feel alike, and everything just feels more refined and polished. Again, what Baldur's Gate 3 lacks in scope, it more than makes up for in its capacity to draw you into the plot and keep you immersed throughout. In terms of system requirements, Starfield and Baldur's Gate 3 are more or less identical when it comes to recommended specs. That said, while Starfield requires 125GB of storage, Baldur's Gate 3 actually requires 150, a full 25GB more, which is pretty hefty if I'm being honest. But while you only require DirectX 11 for Baldur's Gate 3, you'll need version 12 for Starfield, and given the fact that Starfield is a graphically demanding game with some huge worlds with highly detailed textures, you're definitely going to need a more powerful GPU, especially if you want to run it on the highest settings. Similarly, while Baldur's Gate 3 recommends an Intel i7 8700K or an AMD R5 3600, Starfield suggests an Intel i5 10600K or an AMD Ryzen 5 3600X. Regardless of which game you choose to play, or even if you play both, most fans recommend installing onto an SSD if you want either to work decently. Based on the nature of Starfield's gameplay, it's more important to get a good frame rate than in Baldur's Gate 3, so while you could probably get away with something closer to the minimum requirements for BG3, I don't think this will work all that well if you try apply it to Starfield. However, if you do have an older PC and want to play Starfield, there are mods that make accommodations for this, so there's more than one way to resolve your problem if you can't exactly afford a new system right now. I will say that one big problem Starfield has suffered with is that it was launched just 1 month after Baldur's Gate 3 saw a full release. This may have been unintentional, but because of this, it's invited a lot of comparison and thus a lot of criticism. But I think that even if there was a larger gap between the two games, people would still compare them. The bigger problem here is that the way Starfield was marketed was something of a miscalculation. I think all the hype that was generated around it made fans, myself included, believe that this was going to be the video game to end all video games. And who wouldn't want to believe something like that? I will say that even though I had high hopes, I did constantly think to myself, it just sounds way too good to be true, and indeed, it was. Does this mean Starfield is a bad game? Not at all. But is it what was promised? Not really, although I'm sure some of you will disagree with that statement. Ultimately, the biggest problem with Starfield, as many critics have pointed out, is its absolutely enormous scope. Trying to build a massive galaxy filled with planets and locations to visit is supremely ambitious, and the fact that this is actually achievable in a game, even if it's pretty lackluster, is still staggering to me. I might be overstepping the mark here, but I think having 50 or 100 explorable planets in like 10 or 12 systems would have just been a better bet than creating 1,000 or so that are procedurally generated. For one, it would still be really impressive, and secondly, you could still have a few worlds that are barren and potentially even more explorable, or at the very least more interesting. I somehow feel like this would have made the Starfield experience feel more cohesive and robust, and I don't think it would have been that hard to achieve. And then you could always release a new system with new planets as DLC. How hard is that? And then you just keep adding new explorable systems, and if they're all interesting and add to the depth of Starfield, it's a massive win all round. Starfield is a great idea that suffers because it's tried to be everything way too soon. This doesn't mean it's irredeemable or even bad, but heavily flawed? Sadly yes. Baldur's Gate 3 succeeds because while it's still big, it's not nearly as big as Starfield. But the world is just more densely populated and refined, and I think that if Starfield had just taken a single page out of BG3's book, it would have been that much better and possibly even given Baldur's Gate 3 a run for its money. I know this is just conjecture and speculation, but I'd like to believe you can see the merit in what I'm saying. Bethesda are legendary developers with some amazing IP, but a lot of Starfield feels like an emptier rehash of Skyrim or Fallout 4. The thing is, you don't really get the impression that they actually care about what their fanbase wants, and that's because they don't. Not anymore at least. They tell their fans what they should want, and of course, many fans go, actually, we want this, but they just don't listen. Larian has succeeded because they have committed to creating an experience that is as closely aligned to fan expectations as possible, and that's because they care about their community. This is also why Baldur's Gate 3 was in early access for as long as it was, and is one of the cases where this approach makes sense. Bethesda doesn't lack talent or ability, not by any means, but the biggest reason why Baldur's Gate 3 is inevitably a better game is because of Larian's attitude, and as they say, attitude determines your altitude, and if you look at reviews for both games, there's just no denying this. In closing, neither game I've mentioned here is bad, but Starfield lacks the refinement, focus, and pacing that Baldur's Gate 3 has in spades. For this reason, Baldur's Gate 3 is the best RPG of 2023, and it may even be the best RPG for the foreseeable future. Starfield is still great fun, especially for Bethesda fans, but you may find yourself a little jaded on more than one occasion. And that wraps up today's video, guys. What do you think about what we said? Is our analysis fair and unbiased, or do you have a different perspective? Please share your views in the comments. Be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for daily gaming, VR, and tech content. From me and the crew here at Metasquad, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Later!